All right. Well, hello. And so this would be our fourth installment of the In Between, and doing a little different today. So, as you can see, we're on um, 1 Samuel 18, 1 through 30. And so, our last one, we had covered basically the anointing of David, and we're up to that point now. David has just defeated Goliath and he's being presented to Saul. And so we kind of picked that up here. And so, as we know, this the characters in this story are really starting to take shape. And so we see that Saul's still king, but he knows that his kingdom is coming to an end. This has already been told him by Samuel. And then we know that David was secretly anointed as the next king of Israel. And so David's star is basically starting to rise and he's on the prominence. And then we also see Saul's son Jonathan start to take more of a prominent role in this story. So we're going to look at chapter 18 today. So let's get to look at that. I'll follow along here. Oops. All right. So let's read along here. So as soon as David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan's life became bound up with David's life. And Jonathan loved David as much as himself. So as I shared earlier, Jonathan just would have been at the battle with David and Saul, his father. He would have seen David kill Goliath and been talking all that. And so it says, as soon as David finished talking with Saul, then that Jonathan's life became bound up with David's life. Jonathan loved David as much as himself. On verse 2, from that point forward, Saul kept David in his service and wouldn't allow him to return to his father's household. So remember before, David was going back and forth checking on his father's sheep, and then he'd be with Saul. Well, now Saul wants David with him all the time, so he wouldn't allow him to go back to his father. And then Jonathan and David made a covenant together because Jonathan loved David as much as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his armor, as well as his sword, his bow, and his belt. And David went out and was successful in every mission Saul sent him to do. So Saul placed him in charge of the soldiers, and this pleased all the troops as well as Saul's servants. I'm getting used to this, sorry. All right, verse 6. After David came back from killing the Philistine, and as the troops returned home, women from all of Israel's towns came out to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with tambourines, rejoicing, and musical instruments. The women sang in celebration, Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his tens of thousands. And Saul burned with anger. This song annoyed him. Yeah, I could believe that. Especially as we are starting to see Saul starting to get very jealous of David, and tensions are starting to rise. And so I could see how that song would be very annoying to Saul. Here he is, the king, and someone else, a younger man, is showing him up. And we'll continue on. They credited David with tens of thousands, he said, but only credit me with thousands? What's next for him? The kingdom itself? So Saul kept a close eye on David from that point on. So yeah, we see things are starting to take an ominous shift. Saul is becoming very jealous. But in looking at the first few verses here, we see this kind of odd relationship start to develop between David and Jonathan. And maybe you're asking yourself, well, what's going on there? What's that all about? What's happening with them? Well, I want to address that more later. So let's just kind of put a pin in that right now, and we'll talk more about that. And actually, this part of this, as we'll see through this whole chapter as a whole, kind of takes more of a shape. So I'll talk about that when I'm at the end. But it's important to know why Jonathan, as we see in verse 4, as he took off his robe that he was wearing, gave it to David, along with his armor, his sword, his bow, and his belt. So why would Jonathan do all that? Well, it's because that covenant they made together. In verse 3, it says, Jonathan and David made a covenant because Jonathan loved David as much as himself. And that was a common thing when you'd make a covenant with someone. And the robe that Jonathan was wearing signified his authority, signified his identity as a commander of Saul's armies, and also his position as the son of the king. And so he takes that off and he gives that to David. And then along with his armor and his sword and his bow and his belt, all of these things that represented who Jonathan was, he gives them to David. It's almost like we get this foreshadowing here because eventually that David is going to be king. Well, who would normally be the next in line, the heir? It'd be the oldest son. Jonathan would be the oldest son of Saul. He would be the next one in line who you think would be the next king. And so he's basically giving David his authority, giving him all of these things and saying, you are going to be the next king. And in this covenant, as I said, they were changing their identities. Also, they were vowing to defend one another. Weapons represented your strength, and the belt is what tied all your armor together, and it represented your covenantal response to the other person, that you were going to defend that person. And we'll see that begin to take shape too, as well as we get further on in this story. When sides are going to be drawn, people are going to be on opposite positions of one another, and whose camp is that person in. We'll see that begin to take shape. And so keep this in mind. Above everything else is this idea of covenant as we continue on. Then we also see too that David is definitely becoming more and more popular, and this does not sit well with Saul, and he gets very angry, and this jealousy begins to burn in him and develop, and that becomes his demise as we read on. All right, so now let's look at the next section here. Verse 10. The next day, an evil spirit from God, or as I said, where it says evil spirit, we think of that as a disastrous spirit from God, came over Saul, and he acted like he was in a prophetic frenzy in his house. So David played the lyre as he usually did, and Saul had a spear in his hand. And he threw it thinking, I'll pin David to the wall. Wow, what a I mean, here's total change of character. We begin to see Saul's character really change. But David escaped from him 2 different times. He tried this. You think David would kind of catch on, but that's the story. And Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but no longer with Saul. So Saul removed David from his service, placing him in command of a unit of 1,000 men. And David led the men out to war and back. And David was successful in everything that he did because the Lord was with him. Saul saw that he was very successful, and he was afraid of him. And everyone in Israel and Judah loved David because he led them out in war and back again. Saul said to David, look, here's my oldest daughter, Merab. I will give her to you in marriage on this condition. You must be my warrior and fight the Lord's battles. I won't raise my hand against him, Saul thought. I'll let the Philistines do that. I'm not worthy, David replied to Saul, and neither is my family or my father's clan in Israel to become the king's son-in-law. And so when the time came for Saul's daughter Merab to be married to David, she was given to Adriel from Meholah instead. Now, Saul's younger, why does it keep doing that? Okay, verse 20. Now, Saul's younger daughter, Michal, loved David. When this was reported to Saul, he was happy about it. I'll give her to him, Saul thought. She'll cause him problems, and the Philistines will be against him. So Saul said to David a second time, become my son-in-law now. Now, you think your family has crazy problems. Listen to this. This is some crazy family dynamics going on here. Quite the thing. And what's Saul's idea for trying to get rid of David? Hey, I know. I'll let the Philistines take care of that. I won't even touch him. I won't have anything like that against him. I'll let the Philistines do it. So he says, I'll put him in charge of the armies. Well, that doesn't work. David's successful in everything he does because the Lord's with him. So he says, okay, I know. I'll make him my son-in-law. Then I can keep an eye on him. And so he offers his oldest daughter, but David says, no, I'm not worthy. I can't do that. And so she is married off to someone else. And then his youngest daughter, though, Michal, is in love with David and thought, okay, this will work. I'll give her to David in marriage and be with him to be my son-in-law. And actually, this will please me, Saul says, because she'll cause him problems. Wow, what a motivation to offer to offer your daughter to someone in marriage because she's going to cause that guy a bunch of problems. What does that say about him? Yeah, just crazy family dynamics going on here. But it's interesting to note that really David should have already been married to Saul's oldest daughter, even though he felt unworthy, because that was the prize of defeating Goliath. If you remember back in that chapter, what they say would the prize would be given to the man who defeated Goliath. He'd give him the king's oldest daughter, give him a bunch of treasures. He'd be exempt from paying taxes in all of Israel. I mean, all these great things, and David actually did it. So really, that would have been part of his reward, but he did not feel worthy of that. So kind of interesting to note that in here. And so this part ends with Saul asking David a second time, "Become my son-in-law, because this woman's going to give you problems. I can keep an eye on you." That was his motivation. Wow, what can go wrong with this picture, right? But let's go to the next section. All right, verse 22. Saul instructed his servants, "Now tell David in private, look, the king likes you, and all his servants love you. You should become the king's son-in-law." So Saul's servants whispered these things in David's ear. So you can imagine that they're like, "Hey, buddy, listen, you know what? Everyone loves you. The king loves you. This is a good deal. Take it." But David said, "Do you think it's a simple matter to become the king's son-in-law? I don't. I'm poor and insignificant." And so Saul's servants reported what David had said, and Saul replied, "Okay, tell David this. The king doesn't want any bridal gift, just 100 Philistine foreskins as vengeance on the king's enemies," as Saul was hoping that David would die at the hands of the Philistines. So when the servants reported this to David, he was happy to become the king's son-in-law. It just keeps getting crazier, doesn't it? And even before the allotted time expired, David got up and went with his soldiers and killed 100 Philistines. David brought their foreskins and counted them out for the king so that he could become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave his daughter Michal to him in marriage. Wow, that's quite the quite the dowry, isn't it? But David gladly did it, and he defeated all those things, and he got all that, and then becomes married to Saul's daughter. But yeah, again, what was Saul's ulterior motive? Oh, surely he couldn't get all that, and the Philistines would kill him. But no, David was successful again in all that he did. And then in verse 28, it says that when Saul knew for certain that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved him, then Saul was even more afraid of David. Saul was David's enemy for the rest of his life, and whenever the Philistine commanders came out for battle, David would have more success than the rest of Saul's officers, and so his fame spread quickly. We thought Saul was jealous earlier. Now imagine how much he is now. And now here, his son-in-law showing him up. He's the one who's the favorite. He's the one that's beloved by everybody, and not so much for Saul. So instead, Saul sees that the Lord is no longer with him, but is with David. And so for the rest of his life, Saul becomes David's enemy. Bad situation to be if that is your father-in-law. Well, now I want to get back to what I mentioned earlier. So what was going on with Saul, or with David and Jonathan? Well, the question that comes up with this, and I've heard this asked from others, is, were David and Jonathan a gay couple? Now, like I said, this has come up. People have talked about this and thought about that. And I'll admit, initially when you read those, especially in a 21st century context, it sure does seem that way. I mean, when you read that, you think, wow, they obviously were a couple. But we need to keep in mind the historical context. What is taking place with them, the historical context of that, and how is love expressed throughout not only this book of 1 Samuel, but throughout the Old Testament as well. And then two, we also need to pay attention of what is meant by covenant. I talked about that a little bit, but covenant plays a big part in really what is going on between David and Jonathan. And so, first of all, we need to look at where it says love and where that is mentioned. And it's used several times in this chapter and throughout 1 Samuel. And so in verse 1, when it says that Jonathan loved David, it's that word aheb, and it's to have affection for. And throughout this chapter, that same word is used. except for verse 3 is the one exception. And that, as we see here, is ahava. And that can also mean love and affection. But it's only used in verse 3. And elsewhere in the Old Testament is found in 1 Kings 10:9. And so in verse 3, where it says, Jonathan and David made a covenant together because Jonathan loved David as much himself. The same word is used, as I said, in 1 Kings 10:9. The Lord loved Israel with an eternal love. So it's that covenantal love. So a different type of love is taking place here. That love that we would know as unconditional love, everlasting love, that love that God has for us, that love that God had for Israel, where he said, you are my people. I will be your God, and you will be my people. And that love lasted for a long time until the time of Jesus, when then he made a new covenant, a better covenant. And that first covenant, that original old covenant, was so binding that even those that who had died on the old covenant were still caught up and a part of this new covenant made through the blood of Jesus. And so that's a different type of love that is taking place in this verse. And that's why when they made that covenant together, that's the kind of love that they're talking about. Love like God has for Israel. And in Hebrew as in English, the word love can have many different applications and meanings. And so, in English, I think the word love is the most abused word that we have. And here's how I can justify that if I do use these phrases. So I love pizza. I love my truck. I love my dog. I love my wife. Now I use the same word love for all four of those, but obviously my love for pizza is far different than the love I have for Melinda. Right? It's a totally different thing, but yet we use that same thing. And so we see the same thing in Hebrew. The word love is used so many times, but yet we know there's a different meaning behind that than just that one word. And so often that abba, that or what was it? Aheb gets translated as love. As opposed to in Greek, there's actually several different words for love, depending on the context and the meaning. So, like we have agape love, that's that everlasting love. We have phileo or Philadelphia. Philadelphia means the city of brotherly love. Well, that's what it is in Greek. Brotherly love, that I love you like a brother. Phileo, I love you like a friend. And so we have all these different words for love in Greek, but not in Hebrew, just the one. And so to better understand then what's taking place between David and Jonathan, we need to take that closer look at that idea of covenant. And so, as I said, Jonathan loved David, as it says, his own soul. And so he wanted to make a covenant with David that, they didn't know what the future is going to bring. Jonathan could see the writing on the wall, that the jealousy building up with his father. And so they cared about each other so much that they made this covenant that they would be as brothers for eternity, forever, that they would exchange their identity and basically saying, I want you into my family, which is what ends up happening as David marries Michal. Jonathan and David then become brothers. So then to conclude this, through this covenant, David and Jonathan were close friends who became even closer than brothers. And this covenant lasted beyond Jonathan's death. And so we see this in the next book of 2 Samuel. But when Saul's lineage is wiped out, David asks, is there anyone of Saul's family that I can honor and remember? Why? Because of that covenant that he made with Jonathan. And he finds Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth, and he welcomes into his own household as his own son. See, that covenant was binding and lasting. And so as we continue on in the story, keep that idea of covenant in mind. And as we see Saul and Jonathan and David, their relationship becomes more and more complicated with each other. And Saul tries to pit one versus against the other. And so understand that what that covenant meant, and that idea of being closer than even a brother. That's what David and Jonathan were to each other. Well, I hope you're enjoying these segments of the in-between. Tune in next time as we'll continue through 1 Samuel. God's blessing.